Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is all about making you as depressed as possible, because the topic is the Great Depression. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and then pay particular attention to those key terms on your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, when we left off last time, we were discussing the Roaring Twenties. And of course, the Roaring Twenties were a decade, on the one hand, that were exciting, that were new. We had the new woman, we had the new Negro, we had the Jazz Age, we had the Charleston dancing. We had these rebellious teenagers enjoying all these new freedoms. Then there was a conservative backlash. Things like prohibition, things, of course, like the Scopes monkey trial with fundamentalist Christian ideas. But the thing was, even with that, even with the conservative reaction, even the immigration restrictions, it was an exciting decade. It was, Babe Ruth, and it was a decade to remember. And then, inexplicably, in October 1929, it all came to a screeching halt. Why? That's what we need to figure out today. And it really goes back to the 1920 presidential election. It starts right there. And we have to go back and talk about politics. Now, I know I mentioned briefly politics. Harding was elected. He had scandal. I get all that. But more importantly, more than the scandal, was this idea of a return to normalcy. In fact, periodically they ask historians to rank the presidents in terms of, greatness, best versus worst. And historically speaking, one of the most consistently worst ranked presidents was Warren G. Harding. And the reality is, and one of the reasons why is he, not only did he have the corruption of his cabinet members, not only was he a womanizer, yes, but with the economy in 1921, when he becomes inaugurated, he sets a new tone. His slogan of a return to normalcy. He wanted to turn back the economic clock, so to speak, to the Gilded Age, when there was no capitalist corporation regulation, no business regulation. He wanted to go back to unfettered capitalism. And he, along with Republicans in general during the 1920s, he wanted to be very, very pro-business. Let them control the economy, let the government be laissez-faire, hands off. And as such, the people who surrounded himself in his cabinet, again, not just the ones who were corrupt, but even the ones who were theoretically capable, competent. So he has this America First priority. Well, what's wrong with that? Put America first, right? Well, it's nationalistic. Oh, by the way, fun fact, I love the slide for a few reasons. One is a return to normalcy. So we discussed that already. Notice the slogans below that, though. Just 4 years ago in 2016, Donald Trump, one of his campaign slogans, of course, was America First. We're going to put America first again. Well, the problem with doing that in the Harding sense was that it was, well, first of all, what America? The average person America? Working class or the business class? And of course, he meant the business class. And of course, this is also a theoretical return to isolationism after World War I. He's going to withdraw from the world, but yet make sure we have these uneven trade deals to support the United States. Okay. And of course, this other slogan there, law and order, which of course was picked up also by Richard Nixon and has been recently in 2020, in summer 2020, was picked up by Donald Trump as a way to prove that he's the man for the job. Again, these are not new by Donald Trump in 2020 or 2016 for America First, but rather these were coined back in the 1920s. And he uses these slogans as a way to undermine the power of the progressive era, and return back to what he believed was a better time, make America great again, which was the Gilded Age, according to people who believed like Warren G. Harding. And those around him believed it as well. He appointed this man right here, man who looks like he's auditioning for the Haunted Mansion at Disney World, death warmed over himself, Andrew Mellon. Now, Andrew Mellon, he was the former head of a very large corporation that made aluminum. And he was appointed as the Treasury Secretary. Now, here's what Mellon believed, and I would say you could stop me when you figure out what this is, but we're on video here. But nonetheless, he believed that the way the economy should work is that you make the wealthy wealthier. Let the rich get richer. Let the rich get really rich. And then they will take their excess wealth and they will reinvest it in their businesses. And they will take that new profit and they will reinvest that some more. And the economy will grow. And as such, all people will be lifted as a result because the workers will enjoy this prosperity as well. Because the money from the wealthy will trickle ever so slightly on the lower classes and everyone will be raised up. And of course, it's called trickle-down economics. As such, as Treasury Secretary, one of his first acts as Treasury Secretary was to persuade Congress to repeal the corporate tax that the Wilson administration had administered. So get rid of the corporate tax rate. And again, this is like step one, the first domino to a reversal of those progressive policies that would regulate big business and capitalism. Now, of course, when Harding dies in 1923, there was some question like, so what's going to happen next now? Well, as far as the presidency goes, yes, that will change to Calvin Coolidge. But the reality is he very much kept in line the same ideals. He kept Andrew Mellon as his Treasury Secretary. And like Harding, Calvin Coolidge believed that you want a small federal government and no business regulation. In fact, Calvin Coolidge is once quoted as boasting, quote, "One of the most important accomplishments of my administration has been minding my own business," unquote. Yeah, in other words, stay out of the way. He's minding his own business, that'll help the business community. So under Coolidge, Treasury Secretary Mellon went even further and convinced Congress to slash the corporate tax rates even more. In other words, Washington had not been this friendly to business since the Gilded Age, the 1800s. Now, Andrew Mellon is not the only important cabinet member you should know here. There was also the Secretary of Commerce. You remember him, the man with a cool hat, Herbert Hoover. Now, last time we talked about him, he was in charge of the Food Administration during World War I, and he did a pretty bang-up job as far as the government was concerned. And thus, he was appointed as the Secretary of Commerce. Now, here's his vision. This is important because remember, he's going to be a future president. So what is his vision? He promotes a different type of capitalism. Remember, Mellon's capitalism economics was trickle-down economics. You make the wealthy wealthier, it will trickle down to lower classes, and everyone will upraise. Now, again, I'm not here to debate it. This is not my opinion one way or the other. This is what they argued. Hoover, on the other hand, is a slightly different version of this trickle-down economics. He argues for a specific type of capitalism which encouraged businesses to voluntarily cooperate with one another. Oh, and with labor. So businesses should just get together and do the right thing, is his opinion. Again, it's very naive, it's very idealistic, because businesses want to make money. But he went further, because he even defined a very specific role of government in all this. Remember, he's a cabinet member, Secretary of Commerce. And what he believed the government's role should be was to not only encourage this voluntary cooperation among business owners, but even government should provide statistics, advice, and even business forums that business leaders could come together and discuss how to make things better in the marketplace. He argued this would increase productivity, decrease cost for all consumers. Now, again, this is incredibly naive. Now, in a perfect world, this would work, right? This sounds plausible. Like, well, the government can provide statistics because obviously businesses are often regional, they're often local. And the government can say, well, hey, there's a new market that's untapped over there. Why don't we head over there now? And the government can provide and facilitate those things. Again, in a perfect world. But that's naive to think about and believe that in the real world. Hoover went one step further in regards to labor. Remember, there's a labor problem still. He encouraged companies to sponsor unions, to create business company-owned unions. That they should improve working conditions and pay better wages, not out of concern for the worker. No. Because that's on them. But instead, as a way to preserve business interests. Wait, hold on here. Sponsor unions, pay better wages, not because you care about actual people who work for you, because, well, bottom line is it'll actually improve efficiency because maybe people will not quit so often. You retain employees, they'll be more efficient, and maybe they'll want to work more. So again, it's not out of some decency or some moral obligation, but rather selfish business interest. Now, this whole idea that he's talking about here, so government should come in and, well, facilitate cooperation among businesses. That's just a bad idea. It is, because it's going to be corrupt. Secondly, that these businesses should just voluntarily and magically give more money to their employees. Again, if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. We've lived through this in the Gilded Age already. Now, what this term is called, so remember, we had trickle-down economics for Mellon. Hoover's idea was known as welfare capitalism. And it became a very influential idea during the 1920s. And again, there were some businesses that actually did embrace this. Henry Ford is one, for example. Henry Ford paid the highest wages of any major factory in the United States. He paid a $5 workday. And again, I understand $5 is not much anymore. I get it. The $5 a day, though, this idea of the $5 wage, this was more than you could make at any factory. And even Ford argued that, hey, if you work for me, you should be paid enough that you can afford to buy the product you make. So in other words, you build a Model T, you should make enough money to be able to drive a Model T. And this is a nice idea. And Ford did this. Now, why does Ford do this? Now, number one, he did believe you should do this. Like, he had a moral idea, hey, you should be able to do this and be able to pay for the car that you make. That made sense. But he also did it because he wanted to prevent unions. Ford detested unions. In fact, when we get to the 1940s, he is quoted as saying that he would rather close the entire Ford Motor Corporation than give in to the union. Yes, he's actually quoted as saying that. He hates unions. But he pays living wages. And quite honestly, even though he was anti-Semitic, he was the largest employer of both African Americans and Mexican Americans in any factory across the country. He was the biggest and the largest employer. Now, would it be because he was not racist? No. They were workers. And he hired them all. He did it. But yeah, welfare capitalism. And again, so some did try to do that. But as a whole, do you really think businesses are going to pay more money to employees out of the goodness of their heart? No. So what was the results of all this? So we have the trickle-down economics of Andrew Mellon. We have the welfare capitalism of Herbert Hoover. The result is the federal government was basically placed in the service of big business during the 1920s. The result was a very business-friendly environment. And the result, short term, was a booming economy, the Roaring '20s. It worked. The problem is, much like the Gilded Age, there's boom and bust cycles. And of course, the bust is coming. There's another side of this, though. And one of the reasons why Harding, who started this process, is looked at so unfavorably. And that's because the Harding, Coolidge, Mellon, Hoover tax policies created one more problem that's going to ultimately help lead into the Depression. It concentrated the wealth, more wealth, into the hands of fewer individuals and corporations. Remember back to the Gilded Age, how much did life suck at the Gilded Age? Let me count the ways of wealth inequality. I showed you that graph. They started to go back a little bit and help bridge that gap during the person. Now, I'm not saying it got close at all, but they were slowly closing that gap in the Progressive era. Thanks to Hoover, Coolidge, Harding, Mellon. That gulf between the rich and the poor spread out to the point where it was as bad or worse than the Gilded Age. And all of this leads up to the 1928 election. In 1928 election, Calvin Coolidge chose not to run again for re-election. Remember, he took over in 1923. He ran for election in 24. He won. And in 28, he could have ran for a second term, and he chose not to. And instead, Republicans nominate this man right here, Herbert Hoover. The thing is, let's give Hoover credit where credit's due. I'll make fun of his policy on economics a lot. It was a bad policy. It's just not going to work. It's naive. What Hoover was good at, he was a good administrator. He did a good job during the war as food administrator. He was good at those kind of administrative duties. He is not, however, a good politician. So why does Hoover win? Well, it's the economy, stupid. In 1928, we had a booming, roaring '20s economy. And it's the economy, stupid, because when the economy is good, who gets the credit for it? Whoever's in charge. Whatever party, political parties, whatever the administration is in charge. And therefore, Republicans had presided over the last 8 years, and the economy had been booming for much of that. For at least the last, 6 years. It had a good economy. And therefore, Republicans get the credit. It makes Hoover an easy choice. And Democrats did themselves no favors. The Democrats chose former New York Governor Al Smith. Now, Al Smith, besides the fact that he was a Democrat running in a good Republican economy, had a couple other problems. Number one was he had a terrible speaking voice. And why does that matter? Well, by the 1920s, there was a new medium of media to deal with, right? Newspapers had long been a thing, and they reported on people's, thoughts, their positions, their policies, etc. Pictures of them, great. But it wasn't until the 1920s when radio comes very, very popular, we start seeing the interest in even movies, that you start seeing the importance of people's speaking voice and over the airwaves. Again, mass media. This is something fairly new, and it's not new in 1928, no, but it's really in vogue. And it's said that Al Smith's voice made people who listened to him on the radio just cringe. Oh, and he was Catholic. This is not a plus in a nativist. Remember, we had a lot of nativism in the 1920s. And again, as a Catholic, people just distrusted Catholics. There was this belief, widespread belief in our country for a long time, through the 1960s, that a Catholic would never be loyal to the country. He would be loyal to the Pope first, country second, because, the Pope's in charge of the church. And this was never necessarily accurate, but this was a popular, common belief. And so, it's a landslide victory for Herbert Hoover. And again, I'm going to go back to the previous slide. This is the plan for welfare capitalism, as I had earlier. But 20th election, the people seem to think that welfare capitalism will work. And again, you see the stats. Detroit Journal, Ford gives employees extra money. He doubles pay of auto workers because he's blaming it over capital. And of course, who gets the credit for this? The Republicans, who promote this idea. And of course, Herbert Hoover wins in a landslide. And of course, at his inauguration, by the way, fun fact, he got 60% of the vote. Even though no Deep South state voted for him, he won 60% of the vote. This is incredibly popular and very rare in history. At his inauguration, he boldly proclaims, quote, "I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope," unquote. The economy is booming. There is reason to believe there is hope. Even though some economists have been rumbling that there might be some problems in our economy, who could argue with Herbert Hoover? He has no fears. The future is bright with hope. Now, follow my timeline for a minute here. He was elected in November of 1928. He will not be inaugurated until March of 1929. So March, that's the third month of the year. So let's see, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. Just 7 short months later, after this quote, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Just 7 months after proclaiming the future is bright with hope, the stock market crashed. On that day, the single most devastating day in the market's history, stocks fell by more than 37%. Now, that's just a number. Over $16 billion in shares were dumped. 16 billion shares were dumped, worth $4 billion in just 4 hours. The stock market lost $4 billion in 4 hours. And the thing is, Black Tuesday was only the beginning. It fell 37% that day. By the time 1930 comes around, just 2 short months later, stocks were down another 50%. Black Tuesday was only the beginning. And over the next 2 years, the stock market will continue to go down, down, down. Why? Now, please note for a minute. The stock market crash, hear me out. This is very important. You should never mistake this. Black Tuesday, the stock market crash on Black Tuesday, did not cause the Great Depression. It was a symptom. It was perhaps you could say the first domino to fall. But it is not the cause. It was just kind of the first outward manifestation that everyone said, oh, we got a problem. So what did cause it? If not the stock market crash in 1929, which everyone points to, what did cause it? Because the reality is in 1929, only 3% of Americans actually own stock. So if only 3% of Americans actually own stock, then who cares if the stock market crashes? Because the stock market was indicative of a much larger, much bigger problem. So put simply again, the stock market crash did not cause the depression. It was a multi-layered problem. And one of the main things that actually caused it, now, one of them is the deregulation that we talked about already. The deregulation of the business community. We'll talk about that why in a minute, but the deregulation is foundational here. This deregulation caused great fragility in the economy. Why? Rampant consumer borrowing. So even though they didn't own stock, there's some ties to the stock market. Let me explain how. You see, all those new great consumer goods, right? Cars, washing machines, refrigerators, all these different cool new gadgets in the 1920s, radios. They cost money. And much like today, people want it now. People can't wait and save their money and pay cash. No. They want it now. And so if you want to have something now, what do? Well, now you pull your credit card. But back then, there was no credit cards yet. But there was credit. You just usually went to a bank. So when you can't pay for it in full, you go to a bank, you draw out a loan. So even though you yourself are not buying stocks, you are still tied to the stock market via the banks. How? Well, banks were doing some shady things as well. Again, no regulation. Deregulation thanks to the Republicans in the 1920s. You see, what would happen is two things happened. One was this thing called buying on margin. So people who did buy stocks would buy on margin. So this is not the average consumer. This is people who buy stocks. What they would do is they would put down a small part or a small percentage of the total cost of the stock, say 10%. And then they rely on those stocks going up in value to pay the stock back and make money. So let me give you an example. So let's just say, for example, there's a stock, let's just say Ford stock, that costs $100. And so what the goal here is that you are going to buy it on margin. You're going to pay down 10%, so $10. And you're going to buy, let's just say 10 stocks. So you paid $100 for $1,000 worth of stocks of Ford. And the goal is when that value of the economy keeps rising, we're in a boom cycle, right? We're in a boom cycle. And so when that stock goes up to $150, you're going to sell. And so now your $1,000 worth of stocks you bought is now worth $1,500. You will sell them for $1,500. You will pay back your loan. Remember, you owe $900 because you already paid down $100, right? So you owe $900. You pay that $100 back to the bank, and fantastic, you just profited yourself $600. You took out a temporary loan from the bank of $900. You bought it on margin, no big deal. Fantastic. But what happens when the price does not go up, but the price goes down? So now when that price of the stock devalues by, say, 50%, so you paid your $100 for 10 shares of Ford stock, valued at $1,000. The price did not go up, it went down to now it's only worth $50 a share. So now you sell them because the price is still going down. You hurry up and sell it for $500. So now you have $500 in your hand, but you owe the bank $900. The bank calls in your loan. What do? You lose your house, you lose your car, you lose everything. And of course, when the bank doesn't get all their money back because you don't have enough, the bank's now in trouble as well. Oh, and things get worse. Because while private individuals are doing that with bank loans, they were also doing something else, which is called speculation. And so what happened with speculation was that so this idea of buying on speculation was that it artificially inflated the cost of the stock. So because all these people were trying to buy these stocks quickly through these bank loans, so all these people trying to buy it artificially inflated the cost of that stock, where the Ford stock shouldn't have been worth $100. It should have been worth $70. But because everyone starts buying it, it creates a panic. For example, again, it's kind of like supply and demand, ideally. But to give you an example, this summer in 2020, I don't know if you guys have noticed something I did, but one of the things I did during quarantine was I took up bike riding, cycling. Something I haven't done in years. But when I decided I wanted a new bike, I looked around and all the stores are out of bikes. Every store is like sold out. Why? Because everyone's doing it. And so then you go on places like resale markets, like say Facebook Marketplace, and you see a bike that would normally sell for $200 at Academy Sports, and someone on Facebook is selling it for $400. They're like, this is a used bike. It's not even a great brand, but you're charging $400 for it? And why? Well, the answer is supply and demand, but what happens is everybody's trying to buy this. It artificially inflates the price of that bike. Well, same thing back in the 1920s. Everyone's buying the Ford stock, so it artificially inflates the price to $100, and then when the value doesn't go up, it goes down. People lose. They overpaid for the stock. Why does all this matter? Okay, so we have margin, we have speculation. We have these problems. Here's the problem. Remember I told you that these people paid $100 for $1,000 worth of stock that was only really should have been worth $700, but then it dropped by 50% down to $500. So they overpaid for it. They took out too much of a loan because they should have only had to take out a $600 loan. They took out $900. And then the stock goes down to $500. Now they owe the bank. Remember, they sold it for $5. They owe the bank $9. They're in debt now for $400. The problem is if one person does this, no big deal. But when it's thousands of people around the country, now the banks are in trouble. And how does a bank recoup its losses? You don't print more money for banks, no. You call in your loans. So thus far, all we've talked about is the stock market part of it, right? Why the stock market was artificially inflated and why it will come crashing down thanks to speculation. But the domino effect here is that the banks now are out of money because these loans that people use to buy stocks are now dead weight. In order to recoup the bank's losses, the banks begin to call in their loans from people like you, the average American, who didn't buy stock. Remember, 97% of Americans didn't buy stock. So you, as that good American, you bought on credit though. You bought your car, you bought your tractor, you bought your refrigerator, you bought your radio, all on credit. And now the bank says, hey, I know we're supposed to have, you're supposed to have 10 years to pay your loan back. I need the money now. And of course, you don't have the money. And so they take back what they can, which is often your car and often your house. And before they do that, they bleed whatever money you do have. So you are now left destitute. So even though you don't own stock, when the stock market crashes due to bad buying habits, due to lack of regulation to prevent that, the banks begin to suffer. They call in their loans. You can't pay back your loans, so you lose your house and all your life savings. And even if you were one of those good people who didn't have high credit, high loans, when everyone else around you had high loans and can't repay their debt to the bank closes. And your life savings is gone with it. And the result is, you see right here, here's Black Tuesday right here, October 29th, 1929. Boom, 1930, 31, all the way down to 1932. It's going to get a whole lot worse. And because this first event is just the first domino, it starts a trickle-down problem or a domino problem. And as the banks begin to call in their loans, the average person begins to lose their home, lose their life savings as these banks begin to close. And pretty soon, the entire economy is just in disaster. And the thing is, it's only going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. I think that's a good place to stop. You're thoroughly depressed thus far, but don't worry, when we come back for part 2, I will depress you even further. But until then, smile, take care, and bye-bye.